The fluorescent lights of the military medical center buzzed overhead as Dr. Sarah Chen walked through the corridors with practiced efficiency. Her white coat was crisp, her stethoscope draped around her neck like a badge of honor she had earned through years of rigorous training. At 28, she was one of the youngest trauma surgeons at the base, but her steady hands and quick thinking had already saved dozens of lives. The morning started like any other Tuesday at the Naval Medical Center in San Diego. Sarah had arrived early, reviewing patient charts and preparing for what she assumed would be another routine day of treating minor injuries and conducting routine checkups. The base was relatively quiet, with most of the special operations teams either training or deployed overseas. As she entered the trauma bay, her colleague Dr. Martinez nodded toward the schedule board. "We've got a SEAL team coming in this afternoon," he said, checking his watch. "Routine medical evaluations after their return from deployment. Should be straightforward." Sarah had treated special operations personnel before, but there was always something different about the SEALs. They carried themselves with a quiet confidence that spoke of experiences most people could never imagine. Their medical files often contained gaps, classified information that even she, with her security clearance, wasn't privy to. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows when the first group arrived. 6 men in civilian clothes, but their bearing gave them away immediately. They moved with purpose, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings even in the safety of the medical facility. Sarah watched them from behind the nurses' station, noting how they positioned themselves to always have a clear view of the exits. Team 7, reporting for medical evaluation, announced their team leader, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and tired eyes. His name tag read, Chief Petty Officer Reynolds. The others lined up behind him, each carrying a manila folder containing their medical records. Sarah approached with her usual professional demeanor. "Gentlemen, I'm Dr. Chen. I'll be conducting your evaluations today. We'll take you one at a time, starting with Chief Reynolds." The examination rooms were standard military issue, sterile and functional. As Sarah worked through the first few team members, she noticed the usual collection of scars, old injuries, and the general wear that came with their line of work. Knife wounds that had healed into white lines across forearms, bullet scars that told stories of close calls, and the kind of muscular tension that never quite left someone who had spent years in constant readiness for combat. It was when Petty Officer Jake Morrison entered her examination room that something shifted. He was younger than the others, maybe 25, with sandy brown hair and green eyes that seemed to hold more weight than someone his age should carry. Unlike his teammates who had been quietly professional, Morrison seemed almost reluctant to be there. "Please have a seat on the examination table," Sarah said, reviewing his file. "This is just a standard post-deployment checkup. How are you feeling overall?" Morrison shrugged, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere past her shoulder. "Fine, ma'am. Ready to get back to training." As Sarah began the routine examination, she noticed Morrison's hands. They were steady now, but she could see the faint tremor that he was working to control. His pulse was elevated, and when she checked his blood pressure, the numbers were higher than she would expect for someone in peak physical condition. "Any injuries during your deployment that weren't reported?" she asked, making notes in his chart. "No, ma'am. Nothing significant." But his body language told a different story. When Sarah moved to examine a scar on his shoulder, Morrison flinched slightly before catching himself. It was a small reaction, but one that her trained eye didn't miss. She had seen it before in soldiers returning from combat zones, the involuntary responses that their minds couldn't quite control. "This scar on your shoulder, when did you receive this injury?" she asked gently. Morrison's jaw tightened. "Training accident, ma'am. About 8 months ago." Sarah nodded, but something in his tone made her look more closely at the scar. It was clean, precise, and in a location that suggested it hadn't come from any training accident she could imagine. More concerning was the way Morrison's entire body had tensed when she touched the area around it. As she continued the examination, Sarah began to notice other things. The way Morrison startled slightly when a door slammed somewhere down the hall. How his eyes constantly tracked movement in the hallway visible through the small window in the door. The careful way he positioned himself so he could see both the door and the window simultaneously. "Petty Officer Morrison," she said carefully, "have you been experiencing any difficulty sleeping? Nightmares? Anxiety?" For the first time since he had entered the room, Morrison looked directly at her. There was something in his eyes, a flash of recognition perhaps, or maybe just surprise that someone had noticed. "I sleep fine, ma'am," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah had been a military doctor long enough to recognize the signs of combat stress. But there was something different about Morrison. It wasn't just the typical adjustment issues she had seen in other returning soldiers. There was a depth to his wariness, a hypervigilance that suggested experiences that went beyond normal combat operations. She completed the rest of the examination in silence, noting everything in his chart. When she was finished, Morrison stood quickly, eager to leave. "Doctor," he said, pausing at the door, "what I told you about sleeping fine, that stays between us, right?" Sarah looked at him carefully. "Everything discussed during medical examinations is confidential, Petty Officer Morrison. But if you ever need to talk to someone, there are resources available." Morrison nodded curtly and left, but not before Sarah caught something in his expression. It wasn't gratitude or relief, but something closer to resignation. As if he had heard those words before and knew they were hollow promises. After he left, Sarah sat in her examination room staring at Morrison's file. Something was wrong. Something that went beyond the usual post-deployment adjustment issues. She had treated enough special operations personnel to recognize when someone was carrying more than they should. As she prepared for the next patient, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Petty Officer Morrison's story was far from over, and that whatever had happened during his deployment was still very much with him. The question was whether anyone would be willing to listen when he was finally ready to tell it. 3 weeks later, Sarah was working the night shift when the emergency alarm pierced through the quiet corridors of the medical center. The trauma team sprang into action as the announcement crackled over the intercom. "Incoming casualties, ETA 5 minutes. Prepare trauma bays 1 through 3. Sarah rushed to the trauma bay, pulling on her gloves as she went. The charge nurse, Lieutenant Rodriguez, was already coordinating the response team. "What do we know?" Sarah asked, checking the equipment one final time. "Training exercise gone wrong," Rodriguez replied, her voice tense. "Multiple casualties, at least one critical. That's all we have right now." The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, and soon the emergency doors burst open. Paramedics rushed in with 3 stretchers. The first 2 casualties were conscious, alert, and complaining loudly about their injuries. Standard stuff for a training accident, Sarah thought as she quickly triaged them to other doctors. But the third stretcher made her pause. Petty Officer Jake Morrison lay unconscious, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Blood soaked through the field dressings on his chest and left arm. The paramedic rattling off his vitals painted a picture of someone who had lost significant blood and was going into shock. "What happened?" Sarah asked as she began her assessment, her hands moving automatically to check his pulse and breathing. "Explosive training device malfunctioned," the paramedic reported. He was closest to the blast. "Took shrapnel to the chest and arm. Lost consciousness about 10 minutes ago." Sarah worked quickly, cutting away Morrison's uniform to expose his injuries. The shrapnel wounds were serious but not immediately life-threatening. What concerned her more was his level of unconsciousness. The head injury wasn't severe enough to explain why he wasn't responding to painful stimuli. As she worked to stabilize him, something caught her attention. Morrison was mumbling, his words barely audible above the noise of the trauma bay. Sarah leaned closer, trying to make out what he was saying. "Don't leave me," Morrison whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Please don't leave me behind." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. These weren't the confused ramblings of someone with a head injury. There was a desperation in his voice that spoke of something much deeper than a training accident. "It's okay," Sarah said softly, even though she knew he probably couldn't hear her. "You're safe. You're in the hospital." But Morrison's agitation only increased. His heart rate spiked on the monitor, and he began to struggle against the restraints they had placed to keep him still during treatment. His eyes snapped open, but they weren't focused on the present. They were wide with terror, looking at something that wasn't there. "The building's coming down," Morrison shouted suddenly, trying to sit up despite his injuries. "Get them out! Get them all out!" Sarah had seen combat flashbacks before, but never during a medical emergency caused by a training accident. She exchanged glances with the nurse assisting her. This wasn't making sense. "Jake," Sarah said firmly, using his first name to try to break through whatever he was experiencing. "You're at the Naval Medical Center. You're safe. There's no building." For a moment, Morrison's eyes focused on her face. The terror was still there, but now it was mixed with confusion and something that looked like shame. "Doc," he whispered. "What happened?" "Training accident," Sarah explained, continuing to work on his wounds. "You were injured by a malfunctioning device. You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay calm while I finish treating these wounds." Morrison nodded, but Sarah could see him struggling to stay present. His hands were shaking, and not just from blood loss. Every few minutes his eyes would dart to the corners of the room, as if he was expecting something to happen. As Sarah stitched up the larger shrapnel wounds, she noticed something else unusual. Mixed in with the fresh injuries from the training accident were older scars that hadn't been visible during his routine examination 3 weeks earlier. These were hidden beneath his uniform, and they told a different story than what was in his medical file. There was a pattern of scars along his ribs that looked like they could have come from close-quarters combat. A mark on his back that was consistent with a knife wound. Most telling was a small, round scar near his collarbone that could only have come from a bullet that had passed very close to major arteries. None of these injuries were mentioned in his official medical records. Either Morrison had been remarkably good at hiding them during previous examinations, or they had occurred during classified operations that weren't documented in his standard medical file. "Petty Officer Morrison," Sarah said carefully as she finished the last suture, "some of these older injuries weren't in your medical file. When did you receive them?" Morrison's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw something like relief in them, as if he had been waiting for someone to notice, someone to ask the right questions. "Training," he said, but the word came out flat, rehearsed. "Jake," Sarah said quietly, making sure the other medical staff were focused on their own tasks. "What really happened over there?" Morrison closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with an exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. "I can't talk about it, Doc," he whispered. "You know that. Can't or won't?" "Both." Sarah finished her treatment in silence, but her mind was racing. Everything about Morrison's injuries, his reactions, and his behavior pointed to someone who had experienced significant trauma. But training accidents, even serious ones, didn't usually cause this kind of psychological response. As the trauma team prepared to move Morrison to a recovery room, he grabbed Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. "Doc," he said urgently, "if something happens to me if I don't make it through this, there are things people should know about what really happened." "You're going to be fine," Sarah assured him. "These injuries aren't life-threatening." Morrison shook his head. "Not these injuries. The other ones. The ones you can't see." Before Sarah could respond, Morrison was wheeled away to recovery, but his words stayed with her as she cleaned up the trauma bay and completed her paperwork. There were things people should know about what really happened. Not what was in the official reports, but what actually occurred during Morrison's deployment. As Sarah finally headed home in the early morning hours, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled onto something much bigger than a training accident. Morrison was carrying secrets that were eating him alive, and she was beginning to suspect that his team, his commanders, and maybe even the entire medical system were either unaware of what he had been through or were actively choosing to ignore it. The question was, how far was she willing to go to uncover the truth? Sarah found herself checking on Morrison more frequently than her other patients over the next few days. Officially, she told herself it was because his injuries required careful monitoring. Unofficially, she couldn't stop thinking about what he had said before being wheeled into recovery. Morrison was a model patient during the day. He followed orders, took his medication without complaint, and answered questions about his pain levels with military precision. But the night nurses told a different story. He barely slept, and when he did, he often woke up shouting. The hospital's standard protocol was to prescribe sleeping pills, but Morrison refused them. "Says he needs to stay alert," Nurse Peters explained during the shift change briefing. "Won't say why, but he gets agitated if we push the issue." On Thursday evening, Sarah found Morrison sitting by the window in his room, staring out at the parking lot below. His dinner tray sat untouched on the bedside table, and she could see the tension in his shoulders even from across the room. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, reviewing his chart. "Better, ma'am. Ready to be discharged." Sarah looked at his healing wounds. Physically, he was progressing well, but there were other indicators that concerned her. His weight had dropped 5 pounds since admission, and his blood pressure remained elevated despite the lack of physical stressors. "Your body is healing well," Sarah said, pulling up a chair beside his bed. "But I'm concerned about other aspects of your recovery." Morrison turned from the window, his expression guarded. Such as? Sleep deprivation, loss of appetite, elevated stress indicators. These are symptoms I often see in soldiers dealing with combat-related trauma. I wasn't in combat, Doc. You read my file. Sarah had indeed read his file multiple times, and that was part of the problem. According to his official records, Morrison's team had spent 6 months in Afghanistan providing training support to local forces. Routine missions, minimal combat exposure, standard special operations work. But Sarah had also done her own research. She had quietly reached out to colleagues who had served in Afghanistan, asking general questions about training missions and what kinds of casualties they typically produced. The picture that emerged didn't match Morrison's injuries or his psychological state. Jake, Sarah said, using his first name again. I've been a military doctor for 8 years. I've treated soldiers returning from every type of deployment imaginable. What I'm seeing in you isn't consistent with a training support mission. Morrison's hands clenched into fists on his lap. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared out the window at the setting sun. What do you want me to say, Doc? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The truth. Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. The truth? The truth is that there are things that happen in places that don't officially exist, during missions that never officially occurred, to people who are never officially there. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What are you saying? I'm saying that sometimes soldiers get hurt in ways that can't be put in medical files or incident reports. Sometimes they see things, do things, that they can never talk about with anyone. Not their families, not their doctors, not even other soldiers. Morrison turned to face her directly, and Sarah was struck by how much older he looked than his 25 years. You want to know what really happened over there? Morrison continued. Fine. But you need to understand that once I tell you, you'll be carrying part of this weight too. And there's nothing you can do with the information except watch me try to deal with it. Sarah found herself holding her breath. She had pushed for this moment, but now that it was here, she realized she might not be prepared for what Morrison was about to tell her. 3 months into our deployment, Morrison began, his voice taking on a flat, emotionless tone that Sarah recognized as a coping mechanism. We got orders for a mission that wasn't in any official briefing. A compound in the mountains, intelligence sources, extraction required. He paused, running his hands through his hair. The official story was that we were providing security for a training facility. The reality was that we were going after high-value targets who had information about planned attacks on American civilians. Sarah listened without interrupting, sensing that Morrison needed to tell this story his way, at his own pace. The mission went wrong from the start, Morrison continued. Our intelligence was bad. Instead of finding 2 or 3 targets, we walked into a compound full of fighters who were ready for us. We were outnumbered 4-1 and they had the high ground. Morrison's breathing became more labored as he spoke, and Sarah could see sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the room. We fought our way out, but barely. I took a bullet in the shoulder, close enough to major arteries that I should have bled out. Our medic, Corman Rodriguez, kept me alive long enough to get to extraction. The scar I noticed during your examination, Sarah said quietly. Morrison nodded. That was the least of it. During the firefight, part of the building collapsed. 3 of our team were trapped inside. The enemy was closing in, and we had maybe 10 minutes before they overran our position. Morrison stopped talking, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Sarah recognized the signs of a panic attack beginning and moved her chair closer. It's okay, she said softly. You're safe. You're here with me. Morrison nodded but continued his story as if he needed to get it all out at once. Command made the call to evacuate, said the building was too unstable to attempt a rescue, said we'd lose the whole team if we stayed. But those were our brothers in there. You don't leave brothers behind. What did you do? I disobeyed orders. Went back in while the rest of the team was preparing to evacuate. Found all 3 of them, but 1 was already gone. The other 2 were trapped under debris, badly injured. Morrison's voice broke slightly. I managed to get them out, but the building came down just as we cleared it. The explosion threw us all 20 feet. That's where most of these scars came from. Sarah was beginning to understand, and this couldn't be reported because the mission was classified. More than that, Morrison said. I had disobeyed direct orders. Technically, what I did was insubordination. Could have been court-martialed if anyone wanted to push it. Instead, they just made the whole thing disappear. The mission never happened. My injuries were from training accidents, and the 2 men I saved were listed as injured during separate incidents. But you saved their lives. Morrison shrugged. Maybe. One of them, Petty Officer Stevens, he's been struggling with his recovery. Hasn't been the same since. Sometimes I wonder if I should have left him there. If dying in that building would have been kinder than what he's going through now. Sarah felt the weight of Morrison's words settling over her. This wasn't just about one soldier dealing with combat trauma. This was about a system that required its people to carry impossible burdens in silence, to endure psychological wounds that could never be officially acknowledged or treated. Jake, Sarah said carefully, what you did was heroic. You saved lives at great personal risk. Morrison shook his head. Heroes don't wake up every night seeing the faces of the people they killed. Heroes don't flinch every time a door slams. Heroes don't spend every waking moment wondering if they made the right choice. As Morrison finished speaking, Sarah realized that she was now faced with an impossible situation. She had the information she had been seeking, but Morrison was right. There was nothing she could officially do with it. His injuries couldn't be properly documented. His trauma couldn't be officially treated, and his heroism would never be recognized. But as she looked at this young man who had sacrificed so much for his teammates, Sarah knew she couldn't simply walk away and pretend this conversation had never happened. Somehow she had to find a way to help him heal, even if she had to do it outside the official channels. The following week, Sarah made a decision that would change both her career and Morrison's life. She began researching everything she could about classified medical treatment protocols and patient advocate procedures. If the system wouldn't officially acknowledge Morrison's trauma, she would find an unofficial way to help him. Her first step was reaching out to Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a former military psychiatrist who now worked with veterans in private practice. Sarah had met Dr. Harper at a medical conference 2 years earlier and remembered her speaking passionately about treating soldiers whose experiences couldn't be documented through official channels. They met for coffee at a small cafe off base, far from the military environment where their conversation might be overheard or monitored. Dr. Harper was in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of steady presence that inspired confidence. I can't give you specific details, Sarah began carefully, but I'm treating a soldier who experienced significant trauma during a deployment that can't be officially acknowledged. He's showing clear signs of PTSD, but I can't refer him through normal channels because that would require documentation that doesn't exist. Dr. Harper nodded knowingly. I've seen this before. Black operations, classified missions, situations where soldiers are asked to do impossible things and then expected to carry the weight in silence. How do you treat something that officially never happened? Very carefully, Dr. O. Harper replied. And usually outside the traditional medical system, these soldiers often need someone who understands that their trauma is real, even if the paperwork says otherwise. Dr. Harper explained that she had worked with several special operations veterans who had been in similar situations. The key was building trust slowly and providing treatment that didn't require official documentation or reporting. Would you be willing to see him? Sarah asked. On an unofficial basis? Absolutely. But he has to want help. These soldiers are often so conditioned to handle everything internally that they resist outside intervention, even when they're drowning. Sarah knew Dr. Harper was right. When she returned to check on Morrison that afternoon, she found him packing his belongings. He had been officially cleared for discharge and was eager to return to duty. Jake, Sarah said, closing the door behind her, I want to talk to you about follow-up care. Morrison's expression immediately became guarded. I'll report to my unit's medical officer for routine checkups. That's all that's required. That's not what I mean, and you know it. Morrison stopped packing and sat heavily on the edge of his bed. Doc, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but there's no follow-up care for something that never happened. What if there was? Sarah sat down across from him. What if I told you there was someone who could help, someone who understands situations like yours, and it would be completely confidential? For a moment, Morrison looked hopeful, but then his expression hardened again. There's always a catch. Someone always wants something in return. Sarah pulled out Dr. Harper's business card. Dr. Elizabeth Harper. She's a former military psychiatrist who now works privately with veterans. She's helped other soldiers who've been in situations similar to yours. Morrison took the card but didn't look at it. What's her clearance level? She doesn't need clearance for what you'd be discussing. You wouldn't be talking about mission details or classified information. You'd be talking about how those experiences affected you personally. And if word gets back to my command? It won't. Patient-doctor confidentiality applies just as much in private practice as it does in military medicine. More so, actually, because there are no reporting requirements to superior officers. Morrison studied the card for a long time. Why are you doing this, Doc? You've done your job. You patched me up, and now I'm ready to return to duty. Why not just let it go? Sarah had been asking herself the same question. The easy answer was that it was her job as a doctor to ensure her patients received proper care. But the truth was more complicated than that. Because I've seen what happens to soldiers who try to carry this kind of weight alone, she said finally. I've seen them self-medicate with alcohol, push away everyone who cares about them, and eventually either hurt themselves or someone else. You're a good soldier, Jake. You deserve better than that. Morrison was quiet for several minutes, turning the business card over in his hands. There's something else, he said eventually. Something I didn't tell you about the mission. Sarah waited, sensing that Morrison was struggling with whether to continue. The two guys I pulled out of that building, Stevens and Martinez. We were all supposed to rotate back to different units after the deployment, but command decided to keep us together, said it would be better for unit cohesion. That sounds reasonable. Morrison shook his head. It wasn't about unit cohesion. They kept us together so they could watch us, make sure we didn't talk about what really happened. We're not just teammates anymore. We're each other's watchdogs. Sarah felt a chill as the implications sank in. Are you saying you're being monitored? I'm saying that if any one of us starts having problems, starts talking to the wrong people, or shows signs that we might not be handling things well, there will be consequences. Not just for us, but for our families. Jake, that's not legal. Military personnel have rights, including the right to medical treatment. Legal and reality are two different things, Doc, especially when you're dealing with operations that don't officially exist. Morrison stood up and resumed packing, but his movements were more agitated now. This is exactly why I shouldn't be talking to anyone, he continued. Every conversation I have, every person I trust becomes a potential liability, not just for me, but for them too. Sarah realized that Morrison wasn't just struggling with trauma from his mission. He was also dealing with ongoing psychological pressure from his own command structure. He was trapped between his need for help and his fear of the consequences of seeking it. What if Dr. Harper could help you without anyone knowing? Sarah asked. What if there was a way to get treatment that was completely off the books? Morrison stopped packing and looked at her directly. There's no such thing as completely off the books, Doc. Not for people like me. But despite his words, Sarah could see something in his expression that looked like longing. He wanted help, wanted to believe that there was a way out of the psychological prison he was trapped in. Just think about it, Sarah said, standing to leave. Keep the card. If you change your mind, Dr. Harper will be there. As Sarah left Morrison's room, she realized that she had crossed a line. She was no longer just treating a patient. She was actively working to circumvent military protocols and potentially putting both Morrison and herself at risk. But as she thought about Morrison's haunted eyes and the weight he was carrying, she knew she couldn't walk away. Too many soldiers had been lost to the silence that surrounded classified operations. If there was a chance to save one of them, she had to take it. The question was whether Morrison would be brave enough to take it too. 2 months passed before Sarah heard from Morrison again. She had returned to her regular duties, treating the steady stream of military personnel who came through the medical center. But she found herself thinking about him often. She wondered if he had contacted Dr. Harper, if he was getting the help he needed, or if he was still carrying his burden alone. The answer came on a rainy Thursday evening when Sarah was finishing her shift. She was updating patient charts when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Dr. Chen, this is Jake Morrison. Can we talk? It's important. Sarah's heart rate increased as she typed back. Of course. Where and when? Tonight. The coffee shop on Harbor Drive, the one near the marina. 9 p.m. Sarah arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, choosing a table in the back corner where they could talk privately. The place was nearly empty, just a few college students with laptops and an elderly couple sharing a dessert. When Morrison walked in, she barely recognized him. He had lost significant weight and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of months of poor sleep. His clothes hung loose on his frame and he moved with the careful, controlled movements of someone who was fighting to hold himself together. "Thank you for coming," Morrison said as he sat down across from her. He had ordered a black coffee but wasn't drinking it, just holding the cup like he needed something warm to anchor him. "How have you been, Jake?" Sarah asked, though his appearance already answered her question. "Not good," Morrison admitted. "That's why I'm here. I need help, but I'm not sure how to get it without making things worse." "Did you contact Dr. Harper?" Morrison nodded. "I called her about 6 weeks ago. We've been meeting once a week. She's been helping, but there's a problem." Sarah waited for him to continue. "I think my command knows," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 weeks ago, I was called in for a random psychological evaluation. They said it was routine, but the timing was suspicious. Then last week, Stevens was transferred to a different unit without explanation. "Stevens is one of the men you saved?" "Yes, and Martinez has been assigned to extended training that will keep him away from base for the next 4 months. They're separating us, Doc, breaking up the team." Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. "What does Dr. Harper think?" "She thinks I'm paranoid. Says that trauma can make people see patterns and conspiracies where none exist. But I know my command and I know how these things work. They don't take chances with security risks." Morrison finally took a sip of his coffee and Sarah noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "There's something else," Morrison continued. "During my last session with Dr. Harper, I thought I saw someone watching her office. A guy in a car across the street just sitting there. Could be nothing, but you don't think it's nothing." "I don't know what to think anymore. Maybe Dr. Harper is right and I'm seeing threats that aren't there. Or maybe I'm putting her in danger just by going to see her." Sarah studied Morrison's face. The paranoia could be a symptom of his trauma, but it could also be a rational response to a genuine threat. Given what he had told her about classified operations and the pressure to keep silent, both possibilities seemed equally likely. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked. Morrison was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the rain falling on the marina. "I want to tell the truth," he said finally, "about what really happened on that mission, about how soldiers are being asked to carry impossible burdens, about how the system is failing people like Stevens and Martinez and me. That's a big decision. Jake, there could be serious consequences. There are already serious consequences. Stevens tried to kill himself last month. Did you know that?" "They covered it up, said he had an accident during training. But I talked to his wife. He told her he couldn't live with what we had to do over there." Sarah felt sick. "Is he okay?" "Physically, yes. Mentally, I don't think any of us are okay. And we're not going to get better as long as we have to pretend that what happened to us never happened." Morrison leaned forward, and Sarah could see a determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," Morrison continued. "What if there was a way to tell the story without compromising operational security? What if I could talk about the human cost of these missions without revealing classified details? What are you proposing?" "I want to go public. Not about the mission specifics, but about what it does to soldiers when they're asked to carry this kind of secret. I want people to know that there are men and women coming home from places that don't officially exist, carrying wounds that can't be officially treated." Sarah realized that Morrison was asking her to help him with something that could destroy both of their careers and potentially land them in serious legal trouble. But as she looked at his haunted expression, she also understood that he was drowning, and this might be his only way to save himself and others like him. "How would you do it?" Sarah asked carefully. "There's a journalist, Maria Santos, who specializes in military issues. She's written several pieces about veteran mental health and PTSD. I've been reading her work, and she seems to understand the complexity of these situations." Morrison pulled out his phone and showed Sarah several articles. Santos had indeed written thoughtfully about the challenges facing returning veterans, and her work showed a deep understanding of military culture and the obstacles soldiers faced in getting proper mental health care. "I contacted her office yesterday," Morrison continued. "I told her I had a story about classified operations and their impact on soldier mental health. She's interested, but she wants to verify my credibility before we meet. What kind of verification? She wants to speak with someone who can confirm that I am who I say I am, and that my claims about being involved in classified operations are legitimate. Someone with medical credentials who has treated me. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized what Morrison was asking. You want me to vouch for you? I know it's a lot to ask. I know it could put your career at risk. But Doc, I'm not going to make it much longer carrying this alone, and neither are Stevens and Martinez, if we don't find a way to get help. To make people understand what's happening to soldiers like us. More people are going to die. Morrison's voice broke on the last words, and Sarah could see that he was fighting back tears. Stevens has a wife and 2 kids, Morrison continued. Martinez is getting married next month. They deserve better than what they're getting from the system. They deserve to have their service acknowledged, their sacrifice recognized, and their trauma treated properly. Sarah thought about her oath as a doctor, her responsibility to first do no harm. But what was more harmful? Staying silent and watching soldiers like Morrison destroy themselves, or speaking up and risking the consequences. If I do this, Sarah said slowly, if I verify your story to this journalist, there's no going back. Once this story becomes public, everyone involved will be under scrutiny. I understand. And I understand if you can't do it. You've already done more for me than anyone else has. I won't hold it against you if you walk away. Sarah looked around the coffee shop at the normal people living normal lives, unaware of the sacrifices being made by soldiers like Morrison in their name. She thought about all the other Morrisons out there, carrying impossible burdens in silence, slowly being destroyed by experiences that could never be officially acknowledged. There would have to be conditions, Sarah said finally. Your identity would need to be protected. No mission details that could compromise ongoing operations. The focus would have to be on the human cost, not the operational specifics. Morrison's eyes widened with hope. You'll do it. I'll talk to Maria Santos. I'll verify that you are who you say you are, and that you've experienced significant trauma related to classified military operations. But Jake, you need to understand that once this story comes out, your military career is probably over. There will be investigations, hearings, possibly criminal charges. My military career is already over, Morrison said quietly. I just haven't admitted it yet. I can't function as a soldier anymore. I can't trust my judgment, I can't sleep, I can't focus. I'm a liability to my team and a danger to myself. Morrison reached across the table and grasped Sarah's hand. But maybe if we can tell this story the right way, we can prevent other soldiers from ending up where I am. Maybe we can change how the system deals with classified trauma. As Sarah looked into Morrison's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Hope. For the first time since she had met him, he looked like he believed there might be a way forward, a path that led somewhere other than self-destruction. Okay, Sarah said, squeezing his hand. Let's call Maria Santos. As they sat in that quiet coffee shop, planning what might be the most important conversation of their lives, Sarah realized that sometimes being a doctor meant treating more than individual patients. Sometimes it meant trying to heal the system itself, even if it meant putting everything on the line to do it. The meeting with Maria Santos took place 1 week later in a small conference room at the downtown public library. Sarah had spent sleepless nights questioning her decision, but every time she wavered, she thought about Stephen's suicide attempt and Morrison's deteriorating condition. Maria Santos was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp eyes and the kind of focused attention that made it clear she was used to dealing with sensitive information. She had brought a small digital recorder and a legal pad covered with notes. Dr. Chen, Santos began, I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me. Before we begin, I want to assure you that I understand the sensitive nature of this situation. My goal is not to expose classified operations, but to shed light on how our military personnel are affected by experiences they can't discuss through normal channels. Sarah nodded, feeling somewhat reassured by Santos's professional approach. Can you confirm that you have treated Petty Officer Morrison for injuries related to his military service? Santos asked. Yes, I can confirm that, Sarah replied carefully. I treated him for injuries sustained during what was officially classified as a training accident. And in your professional opinion, were these injuries consistent with a training accident? Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment of no return. In my professional opinion, The pattern and severity of injuries I observed were more consistent with combat operations than with standard training exercises. Santos made notes while Morrison sat quietly beside Sarah. They had agreed that he would let Sarah handle the medical verification, and then he would tell his story in his own words. Dr. Chen, have you observed signs of psychological trauma in Petty Officer Morrison that would be consistent with combat exposure? Yes. Significant signs of post-traumatic stress, including hypervigilance, sleep disturbance, and panic responses. The severity of these symptoms is not typically associated with routine military training. Santos turned to Morrison. Jake, Dr. Chen has confirmed that you experienced both physical and psychological trauma beyond what would be expected from standard military operations. Are you prepared to tell me about your experiences? Morrison looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. Then he began to speak, his voice steady but quiet. I want to be clear from the start that I'm not going to reveal any operational details that could compromise ongoing missions or put other soldiers at risk. What I want to talk about is what happens to soldiers when they're asked to participate in operations that officially never happened. Over the next hour, Morrison told a careful but powerful version of his story. He described the psychological pressure of carrying classified experiences, the inability to seek proper medical treatment, and the isolation that came from being unable to share his burden with family or friends. He spoke about watching his teammates struggle with similar issues, about Stephen's suicide attempt, and about the way the military system seemed designed to ignore rather than address the mental health consequences of classified operations. The hardest part, Morrison said, isn't what happened during the mission. It's coming home and having to pretend it never happened. It's watching your brothers fall apart and not being able to help them. Because acknowledging their pain would mean acknowledging something that officially doesn't exist. Santos asked thoughtful questions, focusing on the human impact rather than operational details. She seemed particularly interested in the broader systemic issues Morrison was describing. How many other soldiers do you think are dealing with similar situations? Santos asked. I don't know exact numbers, Morrison replied, but I know it's not just our team. Special operations forces are increasingly involved in classified missions around the world. Every one of those missions creates soldiers who have experiences they can't talk about, trauma they can't officially acknowledge. What would you like to see change? Morrison thought for a moment before answering. I'd like to see a system where soldiers can get the help they need without having to reveal classified information. Some kind of cleared mental health professionals who can treat trauma without requiring soldiers to violate their oaths of secrecy. And accountability, Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength. I want people to understand that when we ask soldiers to carry out classified operations, we're also asking them to carry the psychological cost of those operations. That's a debt we owe them, and right now, we're not paying it. As the interview concluded, Santos assured them that she would protect Morrison's identity and focus her article on the broader policy issues rather than specific operational details. She also mentioned that she had been contacted by other veterans with similar stories, suggesting that Morrison's experience was not isolated. Walking out of the library, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had taken the first step, but she knew the real challenges would come when the article was published and the military bureaucracy began to respond. How do you feel? Sarah asked Morrison as they reached their cars. Scared, Morrison admitted, but also relieved. For the first time in months, I feel like I'm doing something instead of just surviving. 3 weeks later, Maria Santos called to let them know the article would be published the following Sunday in the newspaper's special investigation section. She had titled it The Invisible Wounds: How Classified Operations Leave Soldiers Fighting Silent Battles. I want you both to know, Santos said during the call, that this story has already had an impact. I've been contacted by 3 more veterans with similar experiences, and a congressional staffer has reached out asking for more information about the systemic issues you've raised. Sarah felt a flutter of hope, mixed with nervousness. Maybe Morrison had been right. Maybe telling his story could help other soldiers who were trapped in similar situations. But she also knew that publication would bring scrutiny and potentially serious consequences for both of them. Military investigations, career implications, and possibly legal ramifications were all possibilities. That night, Sarah called Morrison to check on how he was handling the approaching publication. I'm okay, Morrison said. and for the first time since she had known him, his voice sounded genuinely steady. Dr. Harper says that having a sense of purpose, feeling like my experience might help others, has been more therapeutic than months of traditional treatment. And if there are consequences? Then there are consequences. But at least there'll be consequences for telling the truth instead of consequences for carrying lies. As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that Morrison had found something many trauma survivors struggled to achieve, a way to transform his pain into purpose. Whether that would be enough to sustain him through what was coming remained to be seen. But for the first time since she had met him, Jake Morrison sounded like a man who believed in tomorrow. The article would be published in 3 days, and with it their story would become public. There was no predicting what would happen next, but Sarah knew that both she and Morrison had made the choice they could live with. In a system that often forced soldiers to choose between their oath of secrecy and their mental health, they had found a third option: speaking truth in a way that honored both their service and their humanity. The article published on a Sunday morning in November, and by Monday afternoon, Sarah's phone was ringing constantly. News outlets wanted interviews, military officials demanded explanations, and her commanding officer had scheduled an urgent meeting for Tuesday morning. Morrison called her Monday evening, his voice tight with stress. "Doc, I think we opened a bigger can of worms than we expected. What's happening on your end?" "I've been ordered to report to my commanding officer tomorrow at 800. They've also assigned a military attorney to my case, which suggests they're considering serious charges." Morrison paused. "How are you holding up?" Sarah looked around her apartment, which felt strangely quiet after a day of constant phone calls and media requests. "I've been better, but I don't regret what we did. Even if it costs you your career." Sarah thought about Stevens, about Morrison's deteriorating condition over the months she had known him, about all the soldiers who might be suffering in silence, even then. The next morning, Sarah sat across from Colonel Peterson, the chief medical officer of the Naval Medical Center. His expression was stern but not unsympathetic. "Dr. Chen," he began, "I've read the article and I understand your concerns about patient care. However, your public statements have created a significant problem for this command and potentially for ongoing operations. Sir, I was careful not to reveal any classified information. My statements focus solely on the medical and psychological needs of personnel who have experienced trauma. Your intentions may have been good, Doctor, but the impact extends beyond your patient care responsibilities. The Department of Defense is conducting a full investigation, and there will likely be congressional hearings." Colonel Peterson leaned back in his chair. "I'm placing you on administrative leave pending the completion of the investigation. Your security clearance is suspended and you're prohibited from discussing this matter with media or outside parties." Sarah had expected this, but it still felt like a punch to the stomach. "What about my patients, sir?" "Your cases will be reassigned. Dr. Martinez will take over your active patient load." As Sarah cleaned out her office that afternoon, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Her medical career, which she had worked so hard to build, was effectively over. She might face criminal charges and her future in medicine was uncertain. But that evening, her perspective began to shift when she received a call from Dr. Harper. "Sarah, I wanted you to know that since the article was published, I've received over 40 calls from veterans and active duty personnel asking for help with trauma related to classified operations. Jake's story has given other soldiers permission to seek help." 3 days later, Morrison called with news that was both troubling and hopeful. "I've been charged with violation of my oath of secrecy and conduct unbecoming," Morrison reported, "but my attorney thinks we have a good defense. More importantly, Stevens and Martinez have both come forward to support the story. They're willing to testify about their own experiences. That's incredibly brave of them." "It gets better," Morrison continued. "The congressional staffer who contacted Maria Santos is Congressman Williams' office. He's a veteran himself, and he's calling for hearings on mental health support for personnel involved in classified operations." Over the following weeks, the story continued to grow. More veterans came forward with similar experiences, and Maria Santos published follow-up articles documenting a pattern of inadequate mental health support for soldiers involved in classified missions. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. Veterans organizations, military families, and even some active duty personnel spoke out about the need for better mental health resources that could accommodate the unique challenges of classified operations. 2 months later, Sarah received an unexpected call from the Pentagon. A newly formed task force on classified operations and mental health wanted to consult with her about developing treatment protocols for personnel who had experienced trauma during sensitive missions. Dr. Chen, said the caller, who identified herself as Dr. Patricia Reed from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Your insights into the intersection of classified operations and mental health care have been valuable in highlighting gaps in our current system. I'm surprised to hear from you, Sarah admitted. I assumed my involvement in this situation had made me persona non grata with the Defense Department. Quite the opposite. Your professional handling of a complex situation and your focus on patient care rather than sensationalism has impressed many people here. We'd like to offer you a position helping to develop new protocols for treating trauma in personnel with security clearances. Sarah was stunned. Instead of ending her career, her decision to speak out had opened doors she never could have imagined. 6 months after the article's publication, Sarah found herself in Washington, D.C., working with a team of military medical professionals and mental health experts to develop new treatment protocols. The program they created allowed cleared mental health professionals to treat trauma without requiring patients to reveal classified details about their experiences. Morrison, meanwhile, had accepted a medical discharge from the Navy and was attending graduate school to become a counselor specializing in military trauma. The charges against him had been dropped after congressional pressure and a review that concluded he had acted in the best interests of military personnel while maintaining operational security. Stevens had received proper treatment and was slowly recovering. Martinez had completed his wedding and was thriving with appropriate mental health support. Both men had become advocates for better mental health resources in the military. 1 year after their first meeting in the coffee shop, Sarah and Morrison met again at the same table. But this time the atmosphere was completely different. Any regrets? Sarah asked as they sat with their coffee. Morrison smiled, and Sarah realized it was the first genuine smile she had seen from him. None. My life is completely different now, but it's actually my life. For the first time since that deployment, I feel like I'm living instead of just surviving. The program we've developed has helped over 200 personnel so far, Sarah reported, and Congress has allocated funding to expand it to all branches of the military. Morrison nodded. Stevens told me yesterday that he's sleeping through the night for the first time in 2 years. That alone made everything worth it. As they prepared to leave, Morrison turned to Sarah. You know, when I first walked into your examination room, I thought my life was over. I was carrying so much weight, and I couldn't see any way to put it down without betraying everything I had sworn to protect. What changed? You saw me, Morrison said simply. Really saw me. Not just the soldier or the security clearance or the classified file. You saw a person who was hurting and needed help. That made all the difference. Sarah thought about all the soldiers who were still out there, carrying invisible wounds from experiences they couldn't share. The system they had helped create wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to be done. But they had proven that it was possible to honor both the requirements of national security and the human needs of the people who served. As Sarah walked back to her car, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that first encounter with Morrison in the trauma bay. She had risked everything to help one patient, and in doing so, had found a way to help hundreds more. Sometimes, she realized, the most important wounds are the ones that can't be seen, and the most crucial battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in the quiet moments when someone decides to reach out for help, and someone else decides to answer that call. In those moments, healing becomes possible, and wounded warriors can finally break their silence.